All right. Good morning from 9 a.m. Vancouver, BC. Good afternoon to noon in Cape Cod, right, Sarah?
Yes, Cape Cod.
Awesome. I see that we have 8 people online right now. Welcome, everyone.
I
Maybe
see 15.
15 registered. I see 8
Oh,
online right
oh,
now.
oh,
So
okay.
hopefully some folks will trickle in here. So maybe we could just highlight the chat function on the side here if folks want to write where they're joining us from, just so that we know who's in the room, where they are. And then I also just want to take the opportunity to highlight the plus sign in the chat box where you can click ask a question. And Sarah and I will make sure that we have some time at the end to get to those questions as well. For those who don't know me, my name's Jake. I use the pronouns he, him. I'm the executive director of an organization called Next Gen Men, dedicated to promoting positive masculinities, healthy relationships, and gender equity in schools, communities, and workplaces. Our workplace initiative is called Equity Leaders, and it's my situation, it's Sarah's situation, it might be your situation. We're not necessarily in workplaces today, so we're taking advantage of the interwebs here to have these types of conversations. Normally, if we were in person, I would take this opportunity to do a land acknowledgement, which gets a little bit harder with folks joining from all over the place. So I've been holding a little bit of space for thoughts around truth and reconciliation. And I just wanted to share a quick little story that happened to Next Gen Men recently. In one of our mail outs, we used the term circle the wagons. And one of our community members was kind enough to reach out to us and let us know the anti-Indigenous connotations that term carries. And we were able to send out a follow-up email and rectify that and recommit to our belief in truth and reconciliation. So just highlighting that we're still making mistakes, we're still learning and unlearning, and I think that that's the journey that we're all on when we're seeking equity in the workplace here. So without further ado, I do want to introduce Sarah. I have, a bit of a longer bio here from Rotman that I pulled, but you are a very distinguished guest, so we're going to cover a lot. So Sarah Kaplan is the director of the Institute for Gender and the Economy, distinguished professor of gender and the economy, and professor of strategic management at the Rotman School of Management in the University of Toronto. She is author of the New York Times business bestseller, Creative Destruction, and the 2017 book, Survive and Thrive, Winning Against Strategic Threats to Your Business. Her next book, I guess this is a little bit updated, The 360 Corporation, From Stakeholder Trade-Offs to Transformation, will appear in 2019. So that released last year.
It did appear. I guess my bio is outdated. I better fix that one. It appeared in September, yeah.
Awesome. And her research has covered how organizations participate in and respond to the emergence of new fields and technologies in biotechnology, fiber optics, financial services, nanotechnology, and most recently, the field emerging at the nexus of gender and finance. Her current work focuses on applying an innovation lens to understanding the challenges of achieving gender equality. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
I'm really stoked for this conversation. We've crossed paths a few times over the years, and I have to say that your website and the short explainers are some of my go-to resources when explaining gender quotas and meritocracy and all those kinds of things to organizations. So I just want to commend you for that, because sometimes academia can be a bit of an ivory tower, and you're really committed to the knowledge translation. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, we're definitely trying not to be the ivory tower. And I just put in the chat the link to the website. So in case people want to go and check out some of those resources that you mentioned.
I highly recommend it. So during our pre-call, we talked about how diversity and inclusion often exists on this kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs in workplaces. And, when things are going well and, we're seeking identity and belonging, that's when organizations kind of choose to invest in diversity and inclusion. But obviously with this global pandemic and the accompanying changes in the markets, that's changed. We're kind of shifting down that hierarchy. A lot of organizations, obviously there's some that are thriving in this environment. But you made an interesting point about how maintaining or even increasing investments in equity is actually a part of a smart recovery strategy. Can you tell me a bit more how you see it?
Yeah, we had a really fun conversation in preparation for this. And so I'll connect back to that. I think something you and I both struggle with in our work is that a lot of people think of diversity and inclusion as sort of a side of the desk activity, great to have, but when it comes down to it, the bottom line is the thing that trumps. So we're going to invest in it, but we have other priorities too. And so that is something that sometimes falls by the wayside. Or if you're a business leader, maybe you delegate it to your human resources function, but it's not front and center for your own work and your own thinking about what you do. And so I think what this crisis shows is, in fact, that's a mistake. Organizations are very complex. We work to fine tune them. That's what creates competitive advantage, is extremely complicated organizations that, really are able to deliver something unique. And that does increase profits. But at the same time, this fine tuning to the bottom line also makes organizations really fragile. And that's what we're seeing in this economy with our, whether it's at the whole economy level or at the organizational level, is that there are many organizations that are proving to be quite fragile. And if you think about it, organizations that had already been paying attention to diversity and inclusion and maybe had been worrying about accommodating the needs of people with disabilities, accommodating the needs of people who have care responsibilities at home, accommodating people who had long commutes and already had, for example, flexible work from home, all sorts of means and practices, not just the technologies, but the ways of working together, are the organizations, at least for white collar work, that are going to be better able to weather the storm. And the organizations that didn't already have those things in place are struggling much more. And that's an example of organizations that had already been working together, dealing with the complexities and trade-offs that come with accommodating people with different and diverse needs, and co-creating solutions, are those organizations that are now proving to be more robust. So I think that's a small example and a way of thinking about the fact that diversity and inclusion is actually part of your disaster planning. It's part of how you build a resilient organization. And I think what we're discovering now is that many organizations are fragile. What we need is resilience, because this is a terrible crisis. And I hope none of us sees another one like this in our lifetimes, but we probably will. And so we need to build resilient economies and resilient organizations. And the only way to do that is to really bring the full diversity to bear. I have more things to say about that, but maybe I'll stop in case you wanted to intervene in some way to that comment.
When we had the pre-call, the one word I wrote down and underlined was resilience.
Yeah.
And I think that, it's a really great point of the more, like, when an organization is rigid in, structures and history and those kinds of things, the rigidity in these types of situations is what snaps, right? And that resilience gives it that flexibility, that bend and bow that allows to move through that. And so I think it's really important to highlight that flexible mindset. And hopefully,
which is a mindset that you build. Like, that's a muscle that you build. And the only way you build that muscle is by working on having diverse perspectives, working through complex trade-offs. Like, you don't just get to be flexible, you build that muscle, basically. And so that's what being truly good at diversity and inclusion is, what's building that muscle. Sorry to interrupt, but no, I got excited.
I feel that if we're imagining, even just like flexible work from home policies, and maybe the women in the office take more advantage of that, that's not actually a flexible work from home policy, because you're not encouraging everyone to take advantage of it. Because if it was truly flexible, you would be able to withstand when everyone takes advantage of that. right?
Right.
Or having a rigid mindset around what parent takes parental leave and taking that for granted. That I'm putting that kind of gender lens that I look at it through, for sure.
Well, and also I follow a lot of disability activists and disability rights people on Twitter. And the one thing that everyone is universally saying is, for decades, we have been asking for these accommodations because of our disabilities. And for decades, organizations were saying it was impossible to accommodate these needs, and you had to be able to come into the office, and you had to be able to use certain technologies. And now suddenly, when the ableds, that's the language that gets used a lot of times in these Twitter feeds, need these, then suddenly organizations can accommodate them. And so what if we had already been trying to accommodate a diverse range of people going forward? Or let's say we wanted to attract people from the indigenous communities in the North to work in our organization, but they don't want to leave their communities to come to work in downtown Toronto. What if we had actually built in the capacity for them to work in our organizations, even if we're in downtown Toronto or downtown Vancouver or Calgary or wherever people are dialing in from? But somehow that wasn't possible. But now we're discovering that actually it is. And why weren't we co-creating those solutions all along? Because we would have stronger organizations if we had.
Yeah, and I wish I could cite this quote, but I learned this from a disability advocate at some point in my journey. And one of the best things that happened to the disability movement was flipping it and calling it the accessibility movement. Right. Because through the disability movement, it's the person doesn't match the place, whereas accessibility is the place doesn't match the person. Right. And so if we can use that accessibility language in and around all of our inclusive practices, we really see that transformation of workplaces. Right.
And I love that reframing, because we're never going to fix the individuals. We're only going to be able to fix the systems if we really want improvement. And so, yeah, again, from the disability rights space, inclusive design is another example. Like, people talk about the curb cut phenomenon, right? Originally, curb cuts were put in on sidewalks to enable people with wheelchairs or other disabilities to get up and down onto the sidewalk. But then it turns out people who are just a little bit older, people who are pushing strollers, people who have pushing groceries home from the grocery, it turns out everyone benefits from a curb cut. And yet we only got curb cuts when, for example, in the United States, we had the Americans with Disabilities Act, which came in, I think, well in advance of activity in Canada, but really starting in the US and moving globally. We wouldn't have had that without people with disabilities pushing for that, but then everyone benefits. And I think this is going to be another example where so many people are going to benefit by now us all learning how to use Crowdcast or Zoom or what all these other technologies that we're using, or that wonderful technology you have that's typing up everything that we're saying in an insanely accurate way. So, yeah.
Yeah, I actually took the advantage of yesterday creating a little Loom shortcut to explain that. So I'll be sharing that on our social media. If folks want to follow Equity Leaders, I'll be sharing a quick link in and around that.
Yeah, I want to learn how to do that.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for figuring that out with me the other day, because I learned it from someone else too. And I also really like, you're talking about curb cuts. I love that Stanford Social Innovation Review piece in and around that. So I just want to source that people can go check that out, SSIR curb cuts, and they'll find that accommodation piece.
Yeah.
In terms of like the organizational piece, like we know that's the investment in that flexibility, that resilience, those kinds of things. But I think one thing that was coming up for me from what you were talking about is the way that we've structured our financial systems and structures are on quarterly performance, and we're making those very short-term decisions. Meanwhile, we're up against these very long-term phenomenon of colonialism, patriarchy, white supremacy, those kinds of things. So those two things really just don't jive, the quarterly performance where we see those cuts versus those systemic issues. And I've been seeing a lot of articles circulating around how COVID-19 is having and will have distinctly gendered impacts. For example, women are bearing the brunt of unpaid labor at home with childcare, even if they themselves are working. More men are leaning into being caregivers. Women disproportionately work in healthcare, while men disproportionately work in logistics, both incredibly valuable frontline roles at this time. Men are more likely to die from COVID due to deeply entrenched socialization, such as a lack of cleanliness practices, increased risk-taking, such as ignoring restrictions or smoking, etc. And then women are seeing a spike in domestic violence at home. So sometimes it's really easy to paint these things as men versus women, which altogether excludes the breadth of gender. But how can we productively zoom out and look at this through a lens of patriarchy? How do we take this opportunity to reconfigure?
Well, it's a really great question. So first, I would say that was a great summary of some of the gendered impacts. Again, on the GATE website at www.gendereconomy.org, our featured piece right now is a policy brief explainer on the gendered impacts of COVID. So if you want to learn more about that, it has links to a lot of other sites as well that goes into depth on some of these other issues that you were raising, and including a lot of the disproportionate impacts by race, especially if you intersect gender and race and understand the impacts on, certainly in the United States, where the statistics are available. You have a city like Chicago where 30% of the people are African American, yet 70% of the deaths are African American. So we're starting to see, impacts that are, cross-cutting in some of the ways that you highlighted. So yes, the patriarchy is everywhere. It structures our system. The patriarchy and white supremacy combined structure the systems and procedures in ways that we don't even really appreciate, down to some of the things you were talking about, like gendered assumptions about who takes care of children, or about what kinds of jobs people can do. So absolutely, I think that if we can get anything good out of COVID. And right now, it's sometimes hard to talk about that because I think we have to pause and appreciate the terrible tragedies that are going on all over the place, and the people, the care workers who are suffering, and also the people who are suffering from the disease. But if we are going to get anything good out of this, it's going to be an opportunity to have a conversation for reinvention and transformation in the ways that you're talking about. That will call into question some of these structures. I hear all sorts of people tweeting right now. I mean, who knows what will eventually happen, but like, wow, I'll never need to go to a salon again because I've learned to cut my own hair, or I don't need as many clothes. I don't need pants anymore because I just sit on, these technologies all day. Wow, I don't really need, I discovered this because we came to Cape Cod just for a few-day break because we canceled our Florida trip when COVID was starting. And we're very lucky and privileged enough to have a home here. And we came for a few days, and then the travel ban came in. And so we're stuck here. But I literally have this fleece and one other fleece. Like, I don't have, and then I've discovered, well, that's pretty fine. One can get by. So I think a lot of people are starting to think, well, how much do I really need? How many clothes do I need? Do I need to go out to restaurants all the time? Or maybe this is fun to learn how to cook. Do I need to work all these long hours, or is it actually really worth it to spend time making 3 meals a day or whatever? So I think people who have the luxury to have these reflections, and again, I want to be highly sensitive to the people who are working 18 and 24 hours a day in healthcare and other things to take care of us. But for those of us in positions of privilege who have the opportunity to think about this, I think that we are getting a reorientation of priorities. And that reorientation of priorities may lead to some of the things that you're thinking about, like suddenly white collar men, assuming heterosexual couples, white collar men are home taking care of the children too. A lot of dual career couples, they're taking shifts, 2 hours on, 2 hours off with the kids and work. And so men are getting much more involved than they might traditionally get involved in childcare. Are they really going to go back to not being involved at all, once they've gotten involved in this way and their children begin to expect it? I don't know. So I think I don't have an answer yet, but the thing I'm thinking the hardest about right now is, okay, we have this horrible crisis. It's breaking down our society. And is there any hope for us to use this as an opportunity to rebuild our society in more equitable ways, in ways where we question gender roles, in ways where we question consumerism? All these pictures from around the world. Los Angeles, my hometown, has no pollution right now. It's gorgeous. I don't even recognize shots of the city. I honestly don't. Venice, Italy, the waters are clear. So are we really going to go back to a world where those things go away again? So I'm hoping for transformation. I don't know the answer yet. I mean, maybe we can come up with some thoughts during this conversation.
I've been accused of being an optimist. I think
I haven't.
I would disagree with that. I think, you know, if you're in the work of transformation, you're optimistic for better, right? You're optimistic for change.
Yeah.
So, but if I think about it, like, first of all, in gender inequitable relationships and families and those kinds of things, absolutely, I think this is exacerbating some of those very traditional and rigid models, much like in the workplaces that we're talking about.
Right.
But we know that fathers in this generation are 3 times more engaged with parenting than the previous generation alone. And I've been very adamant about this, that, you know, if organizations or government policy or our systems can encourage men to take more parental leave, then, you know, it's kind of a win-win-win. For one, organizations can't take for granted that only the birthing parent takes leave. 2, the men gain empathy for their partners because they're there from the early days taking care of those things. And 3, they learn competence and greater engagement with their child because they don't just come home from work and are handed a baby and told do this, this, and that. They have to take that on fully. And you know, I have a few friends in and around the age where, you know, they have either newborns or young children, and in my conversations with them, they're just so stoked that, you know, they're moving from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting, but they can pop out, they can go look at their baby, and like they can't do that at the workplace. And so I do think that there is that opportunity and that invitation towards transformation. And this is almost like a forced parental leave, because much like, you know, universal basic income or some of these more, you know, socialist type policies that we're putting in, we never would have entertained those, you know, 6 weeks ago, and it's moving really fast. So you know, there's my optimism in and around that for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I have colleagues who've been pushing for universal basic income and have been participating in some of these pilots we were doing in Ontario. And now suddenly, like, everyone's talking about it. And this is a great time to think about that, because one of the things that it does is it puts value on all that, quote, unpaid work at home. And right now we have, the way we calculate even GDP, our gross domestic product, the economy for the country, we only count certain things as economically productive. But the only reason some people can go to work is that some people don't go to work and to paid work, and they they do the work for households. And yet we don't value that in any economic way. Universal basic income is a way to do that. And so maybe we even have an opportunity. This conversation is making me think that maybe we have an opportunity to even rethink how we calculate value in our society in terms of what counts as productive activity. So I think that's great.
I love what you said, and I want to just say it again for emphasis. The only reason some people go to paid work is because other people don't go to paid work. And I love that. And maybe you can confirm this to me, but I feel like I read somewhere when kind of GDP, like the calculation of GDP was coming up, the actual person who came up with it said explicitly, this doesn't capture that unpaid work. It needs to be somehow captured, and was ignored by the government. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, the history of GDP was developed for a very specific reason, which was basically to think about how you would calculate, how you would get a handle on, like, production and wartime. And that's when this was developed. So it was a very specific goal to look at production. But that was something that's very salient in times of war, because you need to understand what's being produced in terms of, you know, different kinds of things that you would need to run the economy or to fight a war. And yet it's become entrenched. And yes, it is. And there's been a huge project among feminist economists for many decades to think of other ways to calculate different kinds of values in our society. And I see there's a question in the chat about happiness. I'm not going to answer that direct question yet, but like this idea that we might actually want to include a happiness quotient in our calculation of how well the country is doing. And if we did that, then we would find that countries like New Zealand and Iceland are probably doing much better than a country like the United States. And Canada may, you know, instead of looking like the poor cousin to the United States, might look actually like a much more successful economy, because we have protections in place like healthcare and things like that actually increase happiness and decrease stress. So I think this might be also an opportunity for us to rethink how we calculate the well-being of society as well.
Yeah, and a lot of the unintended consequences with that as well too, when you choose that as your measure, because it's created this kind of unrelenting growth mindset where nothing is happening. And if we look at, I think personally, a clear example of that is when we look to the States, and because it was the GDP growth mindset, it took industries that don't necessarily need to be growth driven, such as education and healthcare, and transform them as such to include them within a GDP calculation. Whereas if we look at maybe like Denmark, that does have that happiness quotient, education and healthcare are outside of that. But the healthier and more educated people are, the more opportunities they have, which then adds to the economy in different ways as well. So I think that's brilliant.
Yeah.
I think we can sneak in one more question before we turn it over to the audience.
Okay.
Something I'm really curious about. Full admission here, I'm an Albertan from growing up, 17 years of my life there. There is a massive transformation of male-dominated industry happening there. Canada is 51% female, 49% male. Alberta is the only male-dominated province at 51% because of how much male-dominated industry is there. COVID, and then you add in a Saudi-Russia price war. I'm really worried about my home province and where we're going to go from this. And I'm also worried, something that keeps me up at night is the number 1 and 2 jobs in Canada are retail worker and truck driver. And we know which genders predominantly work in either of those. And I think we're, 5 years away from autonomous trucks.
Yep.
How are we in the near term? And this is a big question. I think we're all figuring this out. But how are we going to reconcile the transformation of those male-dominated industries along with transforming kind of those male roles in society, and kind of couch that with the fact that we have an aging boomer population. This is the sandwich generation where we're taking care of our kids and our parents at the same time. So we need growth in pink collar jobs, and I'm really loath to even call them that.
Right.
But in early childhood education, in healthcare, caregiving, those types of things. How do we set up society so that those individuals who will be really impacted by the transformation of male-dominated industries can transition and succeed in those new and emergent industries?
Yeah, it's a really great question, because if we just take your home province, for tons of different reasons we need to transform that economy, right? Environmental reasons, just general trends in terms of where the jobs are going to be and things like that. And so to pretend that conversation isn't a gendered conversation is a problem, and why that it's great that the Canadian federal government insists on there being a gender-based analysis in all of their budgetary activities. That could be much richer and much deeper at the federal level, also at the provincial level. But I just sat in a virtual seminar yesterday, a paper written by a doctoral student, soon to be Professor Alexia Delfino, who's out of London School of Economics, who did a whole study on this, quote, pink collar social work and trying to attract men into social work. And one of the things, that was an experimental model where they were able to actually see what different interventions made and didn't. And the intervention that didn't work was just showing pictures, showing men doing social work. Like somehow that idea of representation didn't help. But when you actually explained to men that there was an opportunity to have a career path and good pay and all those kinds of things, I think a lot of men are put off by, quote, women's careers because they're worried that they're going to pay the pink gender wage gap price of going into a women-dominated field. When you told them that they wouldn't necessarily be subject to that, you attracted more men into the field. And so I think there's a lot of experimental work going on right now to figure out how you actually get men to want these jobs. We know, for example, I talk about the United States because there's so much more data on the United States and research on the United States. That in a lot of regions where, for example, coal mining is cut, there's lots of needs for people to go into nursing, but men won't go in to nursing because it sounds like a woman's job, right? And so we're going to have to fix that, and we're going to have to think about models to do that. And I agree with you that this is going to be a fundamental part of the transition. Just as we've been focusing on getting women into STEM or women into corporate leadership, we also have to figure out how to get men into early childhood education, for example, into education at all levels. At university level, men are very well represented, but at all the other levels, they're not. So I think that if we can use this crisis as a way to open up our notion of gender roles, we may also be able to rebalance the economy in ways that could be quite interesting. So I have a lot of hope for that. But I think we're going to have to not miss the opportunity. Like this is our chance right now to do it while we're in the crisis. And so, you open up by saying gender should be part of the recovery. I think we have to be using a gender lens right now on everything we're thinking about for the recovery, because that's the only way that we're going to get all of this potential. We can't wait till we're recovered to have this conversation again. We have to be doing it right now.
Absolutely. And we need to be upstream as well, too. I mean, to plug Next Gen Men a little bit, right? We're working with 12 to 14-year-old boys in and around these conversations around positive masculinities and gender equity, because, pardon my language, but if there's a culture where a male nurse is told that they're gay or a fag, that's problematic. When there's a culture where there's a man who wants to work with young children in a formative way, they're kind of categorized as a pervert. That's problematic, right? And it very early on entrenches those structures. Right. And I also want to pick up on the nurse story that you talked about. There's a great podcast, I think it's NPR's Hidden Brain, where a gentleman was some sort of Air Force mechanic and leaves the Air Force, and his father-in-law says something like, it's a bit too late for med school for you, but you should, consider becoming a nurse. And he kind of brushes it off. And then he goes to the hospital and gets a job as a security guard. And then when, things go sideways, who's there dealing with everything with him? Who's better paid, respected, educated? Nurses. And so then finally that gentleman takes, the opportunity to go to nursing school. But the caveat was that he still maintained a militaristic style of workout to prove his masculinity and his manhood. Right. And so I really think we need to think long and hard about these things, because I think it's, been really great, the, conversations we've had about women's roles and, possibilities in society. But if we're just putting women in kind of those male dominated spaces, we're actually creating and building more tension, where men feel the man box is getting smaller and smaller and they have less opportunity. So we need to kind of work on both sides of the equation to find that balance, I think.
I'm noticing that your text reader isn't working anymore. So I don't know.
The captions seem to have stopped, and unfortunately I'm worried about changing my window to try to go fix it. So unfortunately, we'll get back to that. Great. Is there anything else you want to say before we answer some questions here in the chat?
Well, you had said in our little outline of things that we should talk about, things that might never be the same going forward. And so I started to create a list, but I don't really know. But obviously, we're definitely going to have more flexible work. We're definitely going to have a greater appreciation for frontline workers and their value in our society. We're definitely going to cook more at home. We're definitely going to buy less, be less consumerist. We're going to connect more with people who are important to us. And we're going to conceptualize events and things like that in a completely different way. For example, I don't know how many people on this call go to D Nice's house party on Instagram. So he's a DJ and he's just been doing a house party, and hundreds of thousands of people go to this house party, and he's just DJing and people are making comments, and, Joe Biden's been on and Beyonce's been on and, Michelle Obama's been on, you could never have a dance party with 100,000 people, but now you can, right? And so there's a whole bunch of things that I think we don't even know how to conceptualize what events or get-togethers could be like until we started doing these things. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to imagine new futures right now that are not, narrow imaginations, but really bold imaginations. So those are, when you asked me the question, I thought, okay, here's some things that came to mind, but I'm sure there's many more according to the people who are listening in. So I don't know if we want to go to their questions now.
Yeah. Well, one, I've clearly been living under a rock. I've never heard of this house party.
Oh, you've completely missed out.
Yeah.
Instagram, D Nice, go for
Okay.
it.
I'll
Yeah,
check it out.
very fun.
But I just want to like reiterate like kind of where we started with this. There's opportunities for innovation and growth from this. And I think a lot of people are falling back into that scarcity mindset. And so I really appreciate you beginning and ending with that.
Okay, good.
So we have a couple questions here. For anyone listening, if you do have a question or a curiosity, please do drop it either in the chat box or using the Ask a Question button. So let's start here with a question from Nicholas. Is there a study we can point to that shows the impact of inclusion on happiness in the workplace? He's very curious about what the reporting, quote unquote, looks like.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think there is, I don't know it off the top of my head. Again, not to like push our website, but we do have a lot of good resources there. If you go to gendereconomy.org, we have a series of explainers. You just scroll down to a series of explainers. There's one called diversity and inclusion. And if you go in there, there's a lot of things that go to that point. We do know that greater diversity and inclusion can increase job satisfaction. It's not exactly happiness. That people don't often measure happiness per se. They measure other more specific things, but it increases things like job satisfaction, job retention, willingness to stay longer in a particular role rather than leaving. So there's some things that we know diversity and inclusion can increase. It's also true that the inclusion point is really important, because if you just do diversity and you aren't inclusive, you can actually lead to greater attrition where people are put into an organization that then kind of antibody rejects them. So it's not 100% like you get diverse people in, you get all this better job satisfaction. You also have to do the inclusion part of it, but a lot of that research is cited in our explainer section, a section on diversity and inclusion. So that would be a place for you to look for more research.
Awesome. I don't know if you did this intentionally or not, but you used a virus pun in your explainer about an antibody. Loved it.
Right.
We have a question here from Kelly. Can you speak more about the use of and value of GBA plus within governments as we respond to the crisis and plan for recovery? And just before you jump into that, I can give one example where there clearly wasn't a GBA plus done, and that was again in Alberta, where there was $12 billion put into a male-dominated industry to support a pipeline. Meanwhile, 25,000 educational aides were laid off, which are obviously disproportionately women, which represents 1% of Alberta's workforce. So I think that we could have used a lens there, but I'll pass the mic to you.
Well, yes, and Kelly, you know a lot about this question, so you are an expert in this area of gender-based analysis. So I think that the challenge with, so for those of you who are not familiar with gender-based analysis, or GBA plus meaning looking at the intersectional aspects, so considering race and indigeneity, disability, socioeconomic class, and things like that, that's what the plus is. It's mandated at the federal level in several provinces as well. And the idea is that you should be analyzing, with using that intersectional gender lens, the different policies and budgetary initiatives that you put in place so that you don't get unequal outcomes of the kind that, you just gave an example of, Jake. The way that the government tends to use gender-based analysis is they come up with a policy, they then analyze what the impact was, and they say whether or not it would have a positive or negative impact. And honestly, quite frankly, mainly just using the gender binary and often not doing the intersectional work that they need, because it's often hard to collect that data. Often they don't have data on race or other things. So it hasn't been done in a fully robust way. So as a result, it's just an evaluation tool of policies that are already decided. What I think the most effective way for gender-based analysis to be done is to use it to uncover the needs, the dynamics, and the issues in advance of designing the policy, and then use those insights to design policies that are more inclusive. And the government really doesn't do that. That's much more of an ex post evaluation kind of tool. And if you did that, you would then maybe avoid the kinds of investments of the things you're talking about. For those of you who aren't familiar with this book, Carolyn Criado Perez wrote a wonderful book called Invisible Women. Oh, I have it right here.
Oh, that's such a good book.
for those of you who haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It just won the Financial Times Best Business Book of the Year. And it goes through a ton of examples from things like all the way down to snow plowing. So for example, if you plow the streets rather than the sidewalks first, that's gendered. That's gendered because more men are likely to be driving. Women are much more likely to be on the sidewalks or doing multiple trips where they're in and out across the sidewalk and things like that. When a town in Sweden went to plowing the sidewalks before sidewalks and like bus enclosures and things like that before the roads, they actually reduced slip and falls by like 50% in their community. And most of those injuries were women. So even down to snow plowing, you can put a gender lens to that and understand it. Automobile, right now, car safety is entirely designed on men's bodies. And even when they do a female crash test dummy in their safety exercises, it's a man's dummy, but female size, so smaller. So it doesn't account for the different biological differences that women have. And as a result, women are something like 74% more likely to be injured in a car accident. So these are all kinds of things that you have to have the gender analysis in the design process and not just in the evaluation of the outcomes. So that's what, Kelly, that's what I'm thinking about and really pushing when I talk to the federal government mainly, really using a gender analysis to generate innovative insights. So again, going back to this point that you raised, Jake, that obviously I'm an innovation scholar. I think about this all the time, but how can we use these insights for innovation as opposed to just a harangue that says, oh, you didn't think about the women. It's like, no, actually you get better products, better services, better policies if you think about this from the beginning. So just
and I think to amplify that, how important it is to look at it from a really systemic level, right? We spend a lot of time focused on individuals. How do we make this one person better or less bad? But if we look at it through that systemic level, we can create and affect change for a lot of people who don't even know at that point in time.
Right.
Yeah.
Good.
Great.
More questions.
Yeah, there was a really juicy one here for me, but I'll ask it, from my perspective rather, but I think you could weigh in on this as well. Sean asks, what are your thoughts on how COVID-19 will impact the toxic masculinity conversation, specifically moving the conversation forward?
Oh. So I don't know if you mean like So one possible response is to say the language of toxic masculinity is problematic in and of itself because it's sort of demonizing of men. And even though it is an accurate representation of some of those gender socializations and gender norms you were talking about, Jake, that are toxic. They're toxic for men, they're toxic for women, they're toxic for people of all genders. At the same time, that term toxic masculinity can become kind of an unhelpful weapon. So one thing to think about is, one, do we need that language? Or is there a different way that we could just be talking about the ways that our gender norms hurt people in all sorts of ways, including men not being able to express their emotions? Another book recommendation, I don't have it sitting right here because I literally just my whole library is basically home in Toronto, is a book by C.J. Pascoe, Pascoe. She did a study of adolescent boys in schools, and it's called, so again, pardon the language, but it's literally the title of the book. It's called Dude, You're a Fag. And basically it's all about the ways that adolescent boys get socialized into certain kinds of masculinity using homosexuality as this tool of policing certain kinds of gender norms. And so it's harmful to everyone, just like we said. So here's COVID. And we know that, for example, COVID is more dangerous for people who are longtime smokers. In China, the statistics are, I think, the men like in Wuhan, they were looking at this, about 53 or 54% are smokers and 3% of women are smokers. So when people say COVID is more likely to kill men, it's not because men, there's something biological or inherent in men. It's a socialization where smoking is seen as like a way to prove, prove your masculinity, but it's also creating all these health consequences as an example. So Do I think this is a great opportunity to surface these issues and talk about how these norms are hurting everyone? Absolutely. The fact that we're seeing a massive uptick in gender-based violence, mainly directed by men towards women, people trapped in their homes with violent perpetrators who happen to be their spouse or partner, I think is going to raise this question again. So I think there's a real opportunity if we find a way to take those pain points and say, look at how painful this is for people. Can we find a way out of this pain? And the way out of the pain would be to rethink these norms. So yeah, I hope so. Is the language of toxic masculinity? It is very accurate in some ways because it is literally toxic, but it's become unhelpful as a tool, maybe because some people react so painfully strongly to that term because it sounds like we're demonizing men. And actually what we want to do is liberate men, honestly. And that's your whole work, Jake. I mean, that's why I love working with you, is because you're trying to liberate men, you know, so. Yeah.
And if I think about it from like a next gen men perspective, you know, some of the framing that I've really loved around this conversation in COVID is, you know, some of those traditional archetypes of men as protectors or providers are being kind of really put to task right now, especially if men are losing their jobs and their incomes, or, you know, especially as a protector, how do you protect from an invisible threat? And so I think it's an opportunity to expand those archetypes, reframe them. You know, you're safe at home, protecting your family by you know, following the guidelines, being a part of your community. You're providing for your family with emotional support and caregiving and nurturing and making sure that they're okay. And it's a reframing of some of those strengths. And I think that that's the tough part with toxic masculinity. It can be a good like a good diagnostic tool, but it doesn't capture the breadth of what masculinities are. Right? It's a singular form. So that was a juicy question. Thank you, Sean. There's a couple other questions in the queue here, but you know, I try to promise that this was going to be 45 minutes. We're at 46 minutes here, so maybe you know, we can record some answers or find a way to capture them and then send them out to folks who weighed in. Otherwise, this will be through this link visible on Crowdcast after the fact, as well as I will get a YouTube link that will be on the Next Gen Men YouTube, as well as we'll get it over to Gate, and you can put it on your various channels. But I just want to say, you know, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. I know that I could always chat with you for hours about this. So thank you very much, Sarah, for the time and for your work.
My pleasure. And thanks for all the questions, folks. And look forward to continuing this conversation with you, Jake. There's much more to talk about.
Awesome. Take care, everyone. Stay safe. Wash your hands. We'll chat soon.